One of the great joys of being in these internet spaces is meeting people of incredible caliber, humanity, insight, openness, who otherwise you would never meet. And it's funny because once you meet those people, it's hard to imagine life having not met those people. Like you can't even remember life without those individuals. And Dimitri would be an example of that kind of person. Dimitri is incredibly insightful. His essay in the Hegel anthology is stunning. He also has one coming in the Nietzsche anthology that is stunning on the spirit child. His presentations are wonderful. And he always brings himself into a conversation in a manner that makes the conversation far better and brings in threads and ideas that connect things together, that not only connect things together, but sublate them to another phase that needs to be explored. And I always appreciate that about Dimitri, and I appreciate you as a person. Dimitri, thank you for being here today. There are many topics that you are so insightful on, whether it be aesthetics, Hegel. You had that wonderful talk with Cadell on psychedelics. We had that wonderful talk on Christianity, mysticism. I really appreciate also the topic of conceptual mediation. Like it's one thing to have a psychedelic experience, but something entirely different to integrate it into daily life. It's one thing to have a mystical experience of the divine, but another thing to figure out how you should live your life that way. And then to also be exploring that in fields of art, but in a manner that ultimately brings it down to the question of, okay, how should we live out these insights, say, in aesthetics or art and in psychedelics? So I always appreciate that about you, Dimitri. So thank you for being here, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, the first thing I'll ask you, Dimitri, is what exactly have you been thinking about recently? What have you been working on? I think you mentioned Hegel's philosophy of the right, some of his aesthetics. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've been meaning to get into the philosophy of right. I've mainly been focusing on Hegel's Science of Logic, and also I'm reading Puppet and the Dwarf by Žižek,
Nice.
which is a great book on Christianity, spirituality, and Hegelian dialectics, and how do we apply them. Very similar to a lot of other Žižek books, since he writes the same book over and over again anyway. Although yeah, so that's basically, I'm in the Science of Logic. I'm truly fascinated by the concept of infinity. So I've been working through that, reading it a few times, currently working on a lecture for my YouTube channel, so you can look out for that soon. And yeah, today I was reading on the one and the many, which is a very difficult part of the Science of Logic. Although I would say that, I'm reading the Science of Logic for the first time, and reading on infinitude, I reread it just after I finished it, and then also started writing about it, and it's a totally different experience. Like reading Hegel for the first time and reading Hegel for the second time is a totally different experience. Because like the way I would describe it is that reading Hegel for the first time is like bungee jumping without a rope. That's completely how it is. And what I notice in myself today was a perfect example as well, is that it's hard to, since every sentence is so packed with meaning and every sentence is so crucial, and he really explicates logic on the lowest level possible, it's very hard to stay aware and to stay concentrated. Whereas it's easier to read other things and like, oh, you miss a sentence, doesn't matter so much. But with Hegel, that's you can't do that. You can't do that with Hegel. So especially the moment where like notions start to self-other themselves, or moments of negativity when something suddenly turns into its opposite. Take, for example, being turning into nothing, nothing turning into being, the one into the many into the one, infinity into finitude, and the list goes on and on and on. This really requires your attention, and I think this is what Hegel means by tarrying with the negative and laboring with the negative, that the very putting of attention or focusing on that logic and letting it occupy your total mind space is practice. It's really a philosophical practice. So yeah,
that was lovely. I hate to admit it now, but I opened the Science of Logic about 12 years ago and was reading it. And I basically went, this is stupid, and threw it away, that it's gobbledygook and different things. And it is extraordinary, though, when you come to the place where you're finally open to Hegel and you let Hegel work on you and you're willing to enter into Hegel, how it can be it's simultaneously training you how to think, but also working on you in a deeper way. Like there is a kind of emotional conditioning that comes with it that almost teaches you how to not merely intellectually think, but kind of emotionally think or full body think, really. The parallel with it, and I was talking with Thomas O'Herlin the other day on Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. Finnegan's Wake, the first time I read Finnegan's Wake, I was like, this is nonsense and quite stupid. But then later on, like 5 years later, I was like, all right, let me go to Finnegan's Wake, and actually was open to it and willing to follow it. And it truly is like an entire world. Like you'll read a sentence and then that changes the meaning of the previous paragraph, and you go back and that illuminates something later on, and it becomes a complete full-blown experience. Like he has things where it seems like gobbledygook, where he's describing a thunderbolt, like thunder, and it's this long sentence. And then it turns out it's a reference to Vico in the New Science of how thunder is the birth of language, because people heard language and knew it represented lightning. Therefore, the divide between the signifier and the signified opened up. And Joyce is playing with that in his description of thunder. Likewise, when he's like in church, it's loud, loud, loud. And it's a play on people saying, Lord, 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 but they're just loud, 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 because they don't actually mean it. It's no mystical, it's just something you're supposed to do. And so all of this is going on in Joyce, and it becomes a pleasure to occupy, but also then Joyce simultaneously in living in that world teaches you how to engage with literature. And you're not the same then after you read Joyce when you read other literary texts, actually. In the same way that in Hegel, after you really get Hegel, it actually changes, I feel like, your entire relationship to all of philosophy. Yeah. It also makes very clear for me that there are true stakes in philosophy, because what Hegel is talking about, like the one and the many, right? We tend to think in terms of either one or many. And Hegel, you use that term with the great Cadell Last on the split one, right? What Zizek talks about. It's like the split one of the many. And what we see in pluralism today is the problem of the inability to think the one and many, like the one slash many, the AB, the split one, and how that actually has massive political ramifications, because we are not conditioned to think about living in pluralism as a people of whom entail difference, because we've been trained our entire life to think it's either one or many, not one slash many, if you will. Well, Hegel is providing a logic to think the one slash many, the split one, if you will, which actually, if we buy the premise that we have to think in a kind of new way, socially or politically, that's an incredibly important ability. Or otherwise, one will think of the many as a threat to the one, as opposed to part of the composition of the one. And everyone necessarily experiences themselves as part of the one, right? Whatever your beliefs are, you're like, these are the beliefs. No one ascribes to their beliefs as one belief of many, but as the belief. Yeah. Well, right? But that poses a problem, because that's ultimately an antagonistic relationship, right? So we have to learn to think of the many as part of the constitution of the one. And it's kind of funny, because I guess it's almost like the world didn't have to worry about the science of logic until now. Like there really was a sense in which it was almost like 200 years early or something like that with the science of logic. Now, don't get me wrong. Maybe we could have avoided some of the horrors of modernity and world wars and totalitarian projects if we took Hegel seriously. But it's almost like you had to go through the experiences of seeing the consequences of totalitarian projects to then really feel, oh crap, we took a wrong turn somewhere. Let's try to figure this out. And then you're finally open to Hegel, right? Because you had a certain experience. And that kind of, and then I'll give it back to you, it kind of actually makes me think about the entire topic, like you've talked, like psychedelics, mysticism, and all these things, because until you have the mystical experience, you don't really take religion seriously, or it's just something you do, right? Oh, you go on Sunday because your parents go. But after the mystical experience, you're like, no, there's something important here. Likewise, after you have a mystical experience with Hegel or true philosophy, then you're like, oh crap, this is really something we have to think through. You take it seriously. Likewise, once the world goes through like world wars, Cold War, and almost blows itself up, it's like, oh crap, we got to figure something out, because we have some very problematic game theory dynamics. And so it's interesting how it just feels to me like that dynamic describes so many different areas of life, where you have to have the experience that then makes you take something seriously that otherwise you wouldn't have taken seriously. But then if you take it seriously, just like the science of logic or Finnegan's Wake, then it becomes an entire world that can train you to carry yourself in the world differently. And you become kind of a different sort of subject, if you will, or you're working with your subject and tearing with the negativity.
Yeah, a lot there. So first of all, I've been reading about Italian history. And of course, everyone knows Hegel is at the basis of communist theory. Hegel was the major influence for Karl Marx. Now, Leon Trotsky said that if the Russian Revolution would have failed, fascism would have been a Russian invention. Now, in Italy, it kind of happened like this. The communist revolution failed, and so fascism was a reactionary reaction against the failed workers' revolts. The thinker at the basis of Italian fascism is Giovanni Gentile, who is a complete and explicit Hegelian. Now, the main thinker of Italian liberalism, and I don't know his name right now, is also a Hegelian. So when we go to Italy, everything is Hegel, and everything has kind of been based on Hegel, even though the communist scene kind of like went away from him with Gramsci and things like that, or Bordiga. But yeah, so there's a lot to think here, like what does it mean to read Hegel today, right? And that's kind of like the question Žižek keeps proposing us to ask ourselves. Now, yeah, I think the correct stance to take would be that even Hegel didn't understand Hegel. Hegel was too early to understand Hegel. That's how we should go about this question, and that is the truly correct Hegelian answer as well, because Hegel is not just this substantial galaxy brain. In some sense, we have to look at these texts and be like, wow, even like the galaxy brain that Hegel was couldn't understand it. And we can have a more complete understanding of Hegel. Now, whatever that means, I don't know. I am 23 years old. I haven't even finished the science of logic, but this is the question that's one of the questions that drives me very deeply in my philosophical pursuit. That's for sure. Now, in the regards to the one and the many, something that I've personally noticed in my own life is that people will use the many to flee the one. They will, and I think this is also kind of where you find what Hegel calls like external cognition. So, when you want to think about something or a one or some kind of being or an existence, it's hard to not get distracted eventually, right? So the way we do this is like we bring other concepts in and we kind of attach other things that have nothing to do with it. This would be external cognition for Hegel, whereas truly thinking a concept in and for itself, or like the concept as it is, requires you to go into the concept. The funny joke, the funny Hegelian joke is that within the concept itself, you can find the otherness to this concept, which is constitutive for this very concept.
Yeah.
And that means that it's not just like you go into a concept and then you just stay with that very same concept. No, like there's a certain implicit logical development that starts to happen when you start really trying to think concepts and logically. That would be with a dialectical logic. Now, I'm also super interested in the distinction that Hegel draws between the understanding and reason, which, to summarize very, very shortly, the understanding is kind of our daily consciousness. It's kind of what we use to make distinctions in the world. Okay, this is not that. Unity is not separation. Being is not nothing. The one is not many. Now, for Hegel, all these concepts, since you can find their other in their conceptuality, that means that they're intrinsically united.
Yep.
So there's even a unity of unity and separation itself, to go very quickly with this. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if you're going to start reading Hegel, you're going to get hella confused, because at first these concepts come to you immediately. So let's say you're reading the Science of Logic, you're starting with being and nothing, and now when I say the word nothing, that is something which entails its being, and that makes sense to us, you know, like this is something we can grasp. But once we get to more difficult concepts, it makes a lot of sense that people would say, yeah, Hegel's complete gobbledygook, and where is he getting these concepts from? And these associations he's making are completely arbitrary. That's exactly the right response that the understanding should have. Now, what does it mean to really go beyond that? Well, that's the big Hegelian mystery, right? But I think that if you look at Hegelian thinkers this day and age, whether it would be Žižek or Karel Last or Alenka Supancic, or even Karl Marx, like the power, it's the power they got, like the speculative philosophical power they got by reading Hegel and really tarrying with it is immense. And yeah, I think it's worth giving a try to go into this. I really believe that Hegel supercharges your thinking, like you've already said. You know, once you read Hegel, everything else, you read it through a different lens, and not every philosopher is really as powerful as that. And even like to bring it make it very personal, is that, you know, once you read a lot and read really deep philosophy, you kind of start seeing through things, even with psychoanalysis. But this would be wisdom, right? Like you have certain life experiences, and then you kind of know the concrete universality of how things in general function. So that means if someone has an idea of, oh, I want to do this, and you went through that, and they have a plan that they have, and you can see, like, okay, this is not going to work. But they're never going to understand it unless they go through it. Well, this is an oversimplistic way that I understand Hegel's concrete universality. One way would also, an example of concrete universality would also be that, you know, psychologists in general, if you compare them to psychoanalysts, don't really take the sexual nature of our unconscious that seriously.
Right.
Now, we could ask the question, why is that? Because obviously, if I look at myself for like 24 hours or 72 hours, sexuality is not only influential, but like determinative of my psyche.
Sure.
Definitely. So this would be opposing the abstract concept of the abstract universality of the concept psychologist to the particular world. But Hegel actually allows us to think deeply in a like properly scientific manner that the concrete universality of the psychologist is the one who has all these like ideas about how the psyche functions, and also relies on a certain kind of failure. So okay, why do they not think sex to the extent that it has to be thought? Well, because they're psychologists.
Right.
And once you make that step from abstract universal psychologist to concrete universal psychologist, you can really think about the state also differently, because people really, really love to critique the state abstractly and really, really love to think of freedom in an abstract manner. They think of freedom as this kind of breaking through, even with sexuality and things like this. Like, oh, once I have this, once I do this thing, then I will solve it. And this kind of tendency that we all continuously have and rely on, well, to undermine this with your own thought is kind of what Hegel allows you to do. And this is kind of what I could call like an atom of Hegel's supercharging your thinking. I feel like, yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say, you know, it's difficult to say like, okay, like this this idea of, you know, Hegel supercharging your thinking, but I do feel like you can definitely like contain more self-othering and like mediation of, you know, particularity and universality, you know, or our thought and, you know, the real world out there, to put it like that.
Outstanding. That was all very, very wonderful. One of the things that's interesting with Hegel is you almost have to know Hegel to read Hegel. But of course, how can you know Hegel before you've read Hegel, right? Doesn't really make much sense. And yet, because it would seem as if Hegel is basically writing his entire philosophy from the start, but can't see his entire philosophy from the start, it's like a mystical vision. Like a mystical vision is something where you get the whole, and if people ask you, you like, hey, what happened? You can't even begin, and you're confused, and you'll probably make mistakes in the description and different things. Hegel seems to have had a realization that when I call that a bookcase, that's not really a bookcase. It's glass and it's handles, and yet it is a bookcase at the same time. Like the moment I try to identify something, within that identification is a mistake. And yet the way I know things is through mistake. Well, then if that's the case, all of our foundations of logic, identity, politics, ontology, epistemology, is basically all wrong. Well, let's put it this way. It's all incomplete. I don't think Hegel would say Aristotle is wrong. He would say it's incomplete. And in fact, for most of history, practically speaking, A is A logic works just as fine. In fact, in your everyday life, 99% of the time, A is A logic practically works. The problem is it's technically incorrect. And when you run in, or incomplete, and when you run into a situation where identifying otherness is critical, you won't have the tools by which to identify otherness, and may end up with totalitarianism, marital problems, because you don't make space for the other, because you think it is self-evident what the truth is, right? So what Hegel has realized is that a logic or a way of thinking that practically works a whole lot of the time is not actually complete. That it is incomplete, and that has ramifications and everything. But the issue is, in glimpsing that, you don't necessarily get all of the ramifications and all of the different areas. And that's where you're saying Hegel doesn't know all of Hegel as he's Hegel, right? The way I would parallel this is I actually think it's helpful to think of what Hegel is doing, and I'm biased, of course, but as like a creative writer. Like, let's take Faulkner. All right, so Faulkner writes The Sound and the Fury because he has this vision of a girl up in a tree and his three brothers below, and they look up and they see the muddy drawers. Okay, and that's Caddy. And he says, and each one of the brothers is their version of what happened. Okay, so here's the question. Did Faulkner know everything that was going to happen in The Sound of the Fury at the beginning, or didn't he? Yes, no. He knew everything that was going to happen, and yet he didn't know everything was going to happen. He had an initial vision that everything unpacked out of, and yet was not reducible to that initial vision, and yet in a way it was contained in that initial vision. So it's a kind of unpacking, and you'll hear a lot of writers talk that way. We mentioned Joyce, in The Portrait of the Young Artist. He sees the bird girl on the beach, and he describes the artist as having like this apprehension of something greater than themselves that they then kind of spend their life unpacking. It's all there at the beginning, and yet not all there at the beginning. And I think that's also what ends up happening in Hegel. And one of the reasons I think also you get such a profound level of divergent interpretations of Hegel is because how you interpret Hegel is completely contingent on how much of Hegel you've read and how you understand what you read, which then reflects back on the previous, changes the meaning of it, but then that reflects back and it goes on and on and on, which of course makes sense because the entire structure of his philosophy is a one of the many. Hegel's very philosophy has an othering kind of fractal nature to it in the same way that you other the bookcase when you try to identify what it is, right? And so Hegel himself, as he's writing it, who seems to be captured in something akin to Faulkner seeing Caddy, is unfolding the vision, and he knows where it's going, but also doesn't know where he's going. The way I like to put it is that the writer is often trying to articulate something they know into something they understand. But then half the time they make a whole lot of mistakes, right? Because you're trying to articulate something you know into something you understand, or something that you kind of sense is there, but you have to conceptually mediate it. And I think the very fact that then in Hegel there's such an emphasis on conceptual mediation is probably somewhat biographical. It is somewhat probably a reflection of his own experience of this insight that logic contains its othering. Oh, so you're then carrying through what that means, which means his entire life is a conceptual mediation of his own thinking. Why is he revising the science of logic so many times, right? Like all over these years, he's going back and he's like, no, well, if he knew the whole from the beginning, he wouldn't have to keep going back. What he finds is that what he's unlocked, it keeps othering itself. exactly what he says. The very structure of his thought is about an othering, which then others itself to him, that then he has to go back and incorporate into what he just said, and then it others and it's others. And that's also, I think, why we can think about Hegel contemporarily, because he's still othering per se to this very day. He's still unpacking to this very day in different fields, right? Like now that you have like artificial intelligence, the existence of artificial intelligence changes what it means to be human. There's a reflective effect, right? Well, that would be Hegel, right? As you read Hegel, it changes the meaning of what came before, and then you go forward, it changes the meaning. Well, likewise, whatever emerges in history changes what came throughout history up to that point, and thus you can, like, the very structure of how that operates has a Hegelian notion to it. And so bringing Hegel's thinking to bear on contemporary issues is embedded in the very internal consistency of his philosophy. It's justified per se. It's not like going back to a philosophy and going, oh, wouldn't it be quaint if we like brought up Berkeley up to speed today? Well, Berkeley's thinking is not in its very nature something of which has a mechanism of becoming contemporary. You see what I'm saying? But in Hegel, there's actually a mechanism of becoming contemporary. That's why it seems like Hegel is uniquely able to be thought contemporarily, even though he's 200 years ago, precisely because there's a mechanism of making him contemporary within Hegel. And then before giving it back to you, no, I mean, the thing is, like with Hegel, if you take seriously what he wants, it like, so basically through all of history, we've gone, hey, that's a bookcase. Yeah, we know that it's made of parts and different things, but come on, guys, it's really a bookcase. We've kind of done this common sense thing, kind of a G.E. Moore sort of like, we all know the bookcase is just a bookcase. Hegel's like, no, it is not. You are avoiding the implications of that thought by simply discounting it in light of common sense or ordinary consciousness, right? And he says right there in that very move is a value assessment that is not justified unless you assume that the whole has some sort of ontological superiority than the split one. Or you could say the one has an ontological superiority to the split one, if I keep using that language, right? Or the one slash many. And Hegel's like, no. And actually, it's almost as if you've been making that ontological hierarchy to avoid the ramifications of taking seriously this thing that you know is there, that you've never actually thought. You know that the book shelf right there is made of parts, and you know that actually it's just shelves and other books, but you've never actually let yourself understand, conceptually mediate what that exactly would do to all of logic, and then everything founded on logic if you took that seriously, because it would change ontology, politics, epistemology, everything. So in the same way that we said that in Faulkner, there's a movement from what you know to something you understand, and in Hegel, there's a movement from what you know to what you understand. What Hegel is like, yeah, you've always known that that bookshelf over there is made of a bunch of parts, and it's, you know, the ship of Theseus, you can never say that the parts are just the whole, but you've never done the work to understand what that exactly would mean. And I'm going to force you to. And then the world will never be the same. So there's a kind of like, you will be forced to conceptually mediate the ramifications of realizing that AA logic is not actually there. You've said for all of history, humanity, that you knew that you knew that the bookshelf was made of parts. You've said that you've known that individuals are always part of communities. But no, we're going to really conceptually mediate the consequences of that thought and see what it's going to do in all of these different fields. And that's like, that's where Hegel leaves us. And that's where we have to thank the science of logic, because we really have not collectively conceptually mediated the ramifications of taking seriously something we claim we all know. But yet we've not fully understood the implications that that would have. It would change logic from AA to AB. And of course, that changes everything.
Yeah. The way I've been reading this, and this is inspired a lot by a great book by Lorenzo Chiesa. It's a book called Logic and God in Lacan, the Not To. He has some what I would call a Lacanian theology in there, and he massively relies on Hegel there, although he never cites Hegel, never even mentions Hegel. But something that he doesn't say, but I like the formulation of that the not one, or the fact of incompleteness, is one. Like this not one is one, and therefore we are in a sense the completers.
Yeah.
That's all we have. And in this sense, like, how many times in the science of logic does Hegel say, like, we don't really have to bring in other things, but we just have to look at what's laying there right in front of us. And in the philosophy of right, he says that reason is the rose in the cross of the present. Now, of course, this is a reference to Rosicrucianism, but what I believe he means, and this is in my reading, is that we are the completers. You know, we as true infinities, as like creative and free subjects, we are the completers of ourselves, of life, of spirit, of philosophy. Now, this is I guess some people would critique this as some kind of dangerous take. I guess that's what Lorenzo Chiesa would say, and we would have to stay in the kind of oscillation that there is. But this is basically where I see a deep relation between philosophy and art, because something that happens in philosophy is that we call things problems and mistakes.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
why do we have this narrative? You know, why do we call things a problem or a mistake? Why don't we like take it up as it is, as some kind of like actual fact of the matter, right? As like having validity as it is a logical moment in our becoming. And in art, you don't really see this, right? Because it's like there's a freedom of spirit in art to do with actuality whatever it wants to do. Imagine like writing poetry, right? You're free with your own imagination and your own thinking there. And of course, you can use the word problem in your poetry, but that wouldn't be an obstacle to your poetry. Whereas, of course, there is an inherent obstacle in poetry. Of course, there is. But this is the very condition of possibility for poetry, right? That would be also, I think, a Hegelian point, like the very, especially like, you know, when as an artist you create art whilst being anxious, or you have ambiguous thoughts about your art, you feel shame about your art, other moments you feel like it's the best thing ever and everyone should like love it. Like this is all I guess relevant to this kind of stuff. So I'm not like, I think when it comes down to philosophy, yeah, it's really great, but it has real limits. And I really love Hegel's theory of absolute spirit here, that philosophy can comprehend the absolute. Art, which is the absolute spirit, has three forms, which is art, philosophy, and religion. So philosophy can comprehend the absolute, you know, with conceptual mediation to a true knowing. Art is like making the absolute sensible. So that means hearing music with your ears or seeing a painting with your eyes. Whereas religion represents the absolute in like images, or think of like Orthodox Christian icons, which are kissed and so on and so forth. Now, I haven't actually read Hegel that deeply on religion, so I'd have to go. Yeah, that's something I really want to do as well. But yeah, this theory is really inspiring for me, since, you know, it is absolute. The way I see it is that it is absolute spirit enjoying the absolute idea. That's kind of what absolute spirit is about, right? And these are like the three absolute forms to do that with. So I think, you know, going into these forms and seeing yeah, what I make of myself as a subject is very interesting, as a kind of like a experiment, a scientific experiment in the philosophical sense.
No, that's magnificent. So, you know, a few things. First off, if anyone's wondering, this is carrot juice. It's utterly disgusting, but it's supposed to be good for you. I have no idea if it is. We'll find out. You know, maybe it's just tearing with the negative for no reason. So we'll see. But a few things. One, can you solve Joyce? Is Finnegan's Wake a problem? It doesn't seem like an adequate structure of thought, right? Finnegan's Wake is something you dwell in, and Joyce is someone you always live with. Right? You don't really solve Joyce. Arguably, though, we've taught literature as being a, you know literature when you can fill out a test that names all the main characters and the big start ploy. So we've basically treated literature like it's problems that you can solve, and therefore the humanities department around the world have all died. Like, no one are doing the humanities. Of course not. Why the frick would you do literature if literature is just problems and solutions that doesn't even get you a job? Like, you're going to do the sciences. It's ridiculous. But anyway, they're more like dwelling places, right? You know, and I think Heidegger had a very good sense of this, on this notion that poetry and art kind of taught a way to dwell and carry oneself in the world that we really had to own if we were going to do philosophy well. But I think Hegel knows that very well as well. On the point on you're saying that about the kind of completeness of the human being, the way I always think about it is that humans are incomplete with the I in parentheses. Like, you're incomplete with the I in parentheses. You are the completion precisely in the space of the incompleteness. Also, there would be no human being, there would be no true infinity without human beings, because you couldn't have the self-referential character, right? Like, humans have to exist, which would be awareness of nature. Notion has to exist so that nature can be experienced as a true infinity. Otherwise, it would just be spurious, and not even spurious, really, because you wouldn't even be able, it would just be like truly effaced. But the funny thing is, the moment the human comes into existence, they seem to naturally not engage in true infinity. They seem to naturally engage in the mistake of spurious infinity, or at least they do now. And this is what's very interesting to me. It would seem as if, for most of human history, because there was more of a religious spirit, then human beings naturally believed they were incomplete with the I in parentheses, even if they didn't think of it that way. Because let's say you're a Christian. Well, you're a sinner, and you're not fully saved, and like the divine reality is away from you. Right? In every religion, many religions have some sort of sense that there's something missing from daily life, right? And yet the human being, through the right conditioning, can kind of step into the gap, or better fill it. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not completely, but there's actually, in most theologies, I'm tempted to say every theology, but that will be dangerous, some sort of idea of the human existing in a between space of some kind, right? Yeah. Well, that's an incompleteness with the I in parentheses, right? Okay, well, that was all good and well up until modernity. Now, since people don't necessarily believe as much, and you could debate this, but generally speaking, you know, Charles Taylor in A Secular Age says that religion has actually exploded in secularism. There's more modes of belief than ever before. He calls it the Nova effect. I think that's true, but I would warn that it's also undergone an inflation. Yes, there's more religious options than ever before, but they all are less sticky, less authoritative, and they don't compel action as much. You have more choices, but all of those choices are more arbitrary. So I think Mr. Taylor may make a mistake in suggesting that the character of the experience of a religion is not radically different from what it was before. People experience religions now as things you can choose and customize, not things that have authority over you, which has benefits, but it also has negatives, right? So the point is that Hegel is responding. So if we think of like religion, art, and philosophy, it would seem as if all of those have the ability of making the human see themselves as incomplete with the I in parentheses. Because in art, like take writing a poem or being in the flow state, you know where you're going and yet you don't know where you're going. Like if you're doing the freestyle rap, when you're writing the story, you know where the story is going and yet you don't know where the story is going. And you have to keep relating to it. When you write a story, you relate to it as a true infinity. You do. There's this like a circle going back and changing every single time when you rethink the story. My big thing is I really do talk a whole lot about the phenomenology of the artist, but by that, I'm not merely saying a book. I'm talking about the experience of writing a book. What is it like to write a book? If philosophy paid attention to that, you would see a whole lot of resources for new thought. The experience of doing like a hip hop rap, not the finished product of a hip hop rap. Like I think aesthetic philosophy sucks because they've been asking too much about the finished product of art as opposed to the initial experience of art, the phenomenology of the artistic experience, not the artistic product. I'm obsessed with that. But I think in art, you see the incompleteness with the I in parentheses. In religion, you see the incompleteness with the I in religion because you have a divine, you have a finite, and they relate somehow, but they're irreducible to one another. And the human steps in the void, the gap, where they can kind of complete them, right? Well, you see, what Hegel's doing with the AB is saying, oh, philosophy is like that too, actually. The bookshelf is always not the bookshelf. And yet the human is able to, if they properly conceptually mediate and condition themselves, you can experience the bookshelf as both whole part, AB, parts whole. But you as the human are the only ones who can do that. So the human is able to do that. But here's the problem. One of the problems is if you exist in an age where religion is not there to so readily teach yourself to think of yourself as incomplete, sinner but saved, fallen but Jesus, then that is precisely when philosophy has to update from AA to AB. Okay, because if it doesn't, and you try to look at what is the human, and you only have AA logic, you can't see the human as incomplete in the I in parentheses. You only see that you either see them as complete, therefore not needing philosophy, or incomplete without parentheses, and now you're effaced. Now you have the bad nihilism because you're incomplete and there's no hope and you're just kind of a mess. And so you fall away, right? So without religion to so readily give us the category of incomplete with the I in parentheses, because remember, when you had religion, it also did that to art. When you're listening to St. Matthew's Passion, it's in the context of a religious vision that brings with it the incompleteness with the parentheses. So even if you didn't study the phenomenology of the art, you at least had a sense of art pointing beyond itself, right? Because of the religious context. Well, after religion, art doesn't necessarily have the effect of pointing beyond itself, which I think you can regain by focusing on the phenomenology of it, but you could also regain it in the product of it if you brought back an overall metaphysics that made the possibility of pointing. But for Hegel, that requires AB now. So what has happened is spirit has advanced to a place where because religion doesn't do the incompleteness in parentheses for us, therefore give us a relation of true infinity without realizing it. Because if you're always a sinner and yet always a saint, you're always revisiting yourself and where you fall between those. So there's a circular true infinity going on. If it's not doing that, then then Hegel's like, okay, well, guess what? We're going to do it on the logical ground where you see AB and you will get the practical consequences of what theology would do in the incompleteness now in logic itself. Of which actually would then, I think, open up new religious possibilities, which would make religion much more mystical. That's another topic. It can also revive art. It can also do all of these different things. So what I think you see now is what Hegel seems to be suggesting is that spirit has arisen to a place where in order to regain a sense of incompleteness with the I in parentheses, it will require a change of logic. It will require a change of the very onto-epistemology, because those things always go together, epistemology and ontology, from AA to AB. And if we don't make that change, then there will be pathological consequences. There will be effacing consequences, and there will be dysfunctions that are very, very severe. So I think what you're getting about the human, and the other way I think about it, it's almost like humans are incomplete. You know how there's a story in Genesis where Lot, and he looks, Lot's wife, and she turns to salt, right? Or when Peter's walking on the water, he walks until he looks down and then he sinks. Well, likewise, it's as if when human beings look purely at themselves as a stable state, they turn to salt. Because they're either complete, and that's pathological and problematic, or they're incomplete without parentheses, and that's pathological, so they sink. So there has to be the way of keeping humans from looking at themselves in a manner as if they think they see the completeness, either in utter incompleteness or utter completeness, so that they don't reduce to salt. But that requires the conceptual tools to think of oneself in the world in terms of incompleteness with the I in parentheses, right? And that's what Hegel seems to be trying to provide.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Though I do think that it's really necessary to read Hegel through psychoanalysis.
Yes.
This day, take not only like the fact that there's different ways we can dismiss the unconscious. I think the most one of the most popular ways is to dismiss it and act as if it doesn't matter, to just look away, to not look at the truth, or like deny it or whatever. And Freud said that the unconscious knows no. So a fantastic a famous example that he has here is that I believe it was Freud who talked about this, that psychoanalyst came to him and says, the woman in my dreams was definitely not my mother. Right. So you have to separate this between the woman in my dreams was my mother and not. Now, not is the side of the rational conscious ego that wants to, censor the unconscious, and the unconscious knows no. It's like it was the mother in the dream. So yeah, I think this is something very interesting and to think here, and also in regards to modes of jouissance, because I do think Hegel is ultimately a philosophical scientist. That's what he calls himself, right? So he's not he's not a theologian.
Right.
He does call philosophy like rational theology and a divine service to God, but he also in the lectures on religion, he also says that theologians are like people who don't take in the painting and reflect upon it, but like talk about the contours of it and the different colors and the contrast, but totally miss the point what the painting actually is about. So that's the two sides to it. Now, why I bring in psychoanalysis too is because the question of jouissance is super important and interesting to me, and not jouissance as this kind of like not enjoyment as this thing you simply enjoy because it is nice, like you would enjoy food or something. That would be pleasure, right? But unconscious or like the enjoyment as this as a kind of mode in which you operate and that your psyche operates to. So an example would be that Žižek talks about cynicism being, the ideology of today, at least in the sublime object of ideology, and we have to understand that as a mode of enjoyment. So, like, if you enslave a human being, it will accommodate itself to enjoy its own position in that setting, because otherwise it would just kill itself or whatever.
Right.
It has to get some kind of pathological enjoyment out of this. So this enjoyment, Nietzsche talked a lot about it, is the slave morality, right? Like if you stub your toe and you scream, you don't solve any issue, but it still feels nice when you scream.
Right.
Right. And this is kind of what slave morality does. It's, for the technical word Freud uses, is to abreact. So you can't have an adequate response to it and a reaction to it. So you scream or you lash out or you adopt a certain structure of ideas, a certain kind of metaphysics that accommodates to that situation. Now, the problem with that is that accommodating to that very situation in this mode of jouissance also kind of imprisons you in this situation, or at least it could, and it does with a lot of people. Now, art, spirituality, religion, and philosophy are all very strange modes of enjoyment where people kind of tend to like break out of their, I would say, like the daily consciousness. Also, like the psychoanalytical treatment would be one of those. So I think what psychoanalysis does for me in reading Hegel, it brings a certain kind of different scientific lens, and also something that's perhaps very it brings something like it's when you read Hegel, sometimes you get this very mythical and poetic language, right? Like when he talks about infinity, he says soul and spirit light up once we come to infinity, the fresh definition of the absolute. And I love that stuff, don't get me wrong. Like I love when Hegel starts getting mythical and poetic in the science of logic. However, I also think that there is a certain kind of arbitrariness to it. I don't know. I would have to develop that. But yeah, like thinking psychoanalysis this day and age with as a certain form of science, or if you don't want to call it a science, I'm not really identified with that term. I think it brings interesting thoughts this day in regards to pathologies, because Hegel is not some kind of like metaphysical centrist. He's not saying, one-sidedness is bad, so we have to like see the both sides. No, he really and that's also how you read Hegel. You really have to believe it, and only then can you properly see the self-othering in concepts, the intrinsic self-othering. Because if you just gloss over it and read it and you're like already critical before reading it, you're not gonna get the point, because it's gonna be gobbledygook, obviously. Even to me, when I'm like, I love Hegel, but still sometimes it's like, damn, what the hell is he talking about,
Anyone who claims Hegel isn't every now and then gobbledygook is lying. They're not reading it. So worry not, because that's actually part of it. Like the continual returning of the true infinity, right? There's parts where Joyce is crazy or Faulkner. Like I was trying to write a paper on the Benji sexton of Faulkner. I just was like, okay, with some of his stream of conscious stuff. Well, a few things. I completely agree. I guess Dr. McGowan, in one of the chapters of Emancipation After Hegel, basically argues that Hegel is Freud. He may even call the chapter Freud before Freud, I think. And I think that's completely true. And actually, another scholar who I adore, Merold Westphal, Meroldwestphal, Westphal. He's a genius. He wrote a book, History and Truth in Hegel's Phenomenology, and this was written like 78. And he was warning, he was like, hey, Hegel's basically talking like psychoanalysis before psychoanalysis is a thing. And a good example of this is the master-slave dialectic, which is not merely something he's referring to externally between a slave. He is talking about that, but also there's double entendres, multiple layers that are going on in Hegel. The master-slave dialectic also describes how we feel about ourselves. Like we feel inside as if there's something mastering us that we don't have control, whereas like our true self or our self is kind of at the mercy of that thing, right? And in some respects, it could be the relation between consciousness and self-consciousness, because once consciousness gains an awareness of itself as a self, then self-consciousness is internalized, and consciousness seems like it's at the mercy of self-consciousness, right? Like the ability to apprehend outside the terms of just an isolated ego, right? Well, it turns out Hegel's like, wait a minute, actually, the slave has all the power there. Actually, consciousness has more powerful than self-consciousness. So you can open up to reason, right? So there's a psychoanalytical move that is occurring there while simultaneously talking about a historical condition, because that's always what's strange in Hegel. Like if the whole is in every part and every part contains the whole, then we should consider every layer of the phenomenology of spirit to be speaking with all the other layers of the phenomenology of the spirit, right? I mean, of the spirit. There's a great way that, as Joel sent me on, there's a great essay by Conant, C-O-N-A-N-T, called Kant is not a Kantian. And he's making the argument that a lot of people's interpretations of Kant are based on separating the first critique from the other three. And he said people read Kant as if he's like layers of a cake. You have the vanilla, the chocolate, and the strawberry. And every layer is kind of independent of every other layer. And so you feel like you can kind of separate. It's like, no, they're like intertwined. Like basically, once you put the second layer on, it changes the meaning of the first layer. And the third layer changes those two, and the first changes the third, and they're all intertwined, right? He's also making a point that is very good, where we tend to think that humans have animal sensibilities plus rationality. And if you took away rationality, humans would just be animals. But the point he makes, and Kant does as well, is actually once you add rationality, our very sensory experience is different from an animal. It's not merely that rationality is something you can subtract from humans and then they're just animals, because our rationality changes sensory experience, right? And so likewise, in Hegel, it's not that every layer of the phenomenology of spirit is merely stacked on one another and has nothing to do with all the other layers. They're always dealing with one another in a kind of under the surface manner that then leads you into psychoanalytical understandings. Because then religion becomes something you yourself internalize. Not only is it the community, not only is it other people, it becomes part of your own self-definition. In seeing yourself as inseparably and emergently part of a group that is not reducible to just its parts, right? And so you become part of something that is not reducible to the groups you are in. Well, that's then going to have a change on who you are and what does it mean to occupy, to go in the world. But the psychoanalytical part of Hegel, I think we also can understand why it's there, because in Hegel's day, the closest thing you had to psychoanalysis was basically literature. And the best form of literature would be Greek tragedy. And Hegel, in his younger days, I think, translated Sophocles. Like he was obsessed with translating Sophocles. He considered being a literary major. And he's extremely interested in these tragedies where characters are caught in situations of trade-offs of competing goods. So he absolutely, from his literary training, has a deep appreciation and understanding of the tensions of which psychoanalysis are bringing out in a more explicit manner, but are more implicit in literature. And so we always have to take very seriously how much time he spent translating Sophocles. And he even considered going and being a classics-like teacher at one point, I believe, but then went in a philosophical direction. So you see those tendencies coming up. The last thing I would say is if enjoyment was not a problem, then you wouldn't need conceptual mediation. Like if enjoyment wasn't something that could lead you into problematic pathological relationships if you didn't learn to mediate it, then there's no need for all the stuff Hegel's talking about with conceptual mediation. We need conceptual mediation precisely because of the problem of enjoyment, which is this mixture of desire, self-destruction, benefits, and all those things. If enjoyment was not a problem, you would not need conceptual mediation. And so there has to be a profound sense of the problem of enjoyment. I can never say the French word because I'm a country boy. It starts with a J, you know the term. Jorenzo, I'll just say freaking enjoyment. Like there's a profound sense in Hegel of that, and that's precisely why you need conceptual mediation. Because the very things we desire are also our destruction, and the things that are our destruction are actually what we need. And so if that wasn't the case, if everything was self-evident per se, what you desire was, you only ever desired the good, well, then you wouldn't need conceptual mediation. And so the entire structure, the very being drawn toward a failure is in of itself a move that requires the understanding of why that is and how to then sublate with it. You wouldn't need sublation if you didn't have the problem of enjoyment, really, as he is describing. So they absolutely go hand in hand. And that's, of course, the brilliance of Žižek, right? Where he's bringing the psychoanalytical and he's bringing Lacanian to Hegel. Because before that, basically, the only way anyone could understand Hegel is in terms of the political state. And that's what ended up happening, of course, either in the form of fascism, in the form of totalitarian communism. Because, yeah, if you're, look, to everyone's defense, if you're reading Hegel before psychoanalysis, it's very difficult to not read him referring to some sort of Rousseauian movement, right? Or some sort of development through history of a state, right? And it's hard to get that at the heart of the movement is a kind of failure. What it looks like is a marching through of history. And also, if you're looking at the Industrial Revolution, it looks like there's a sort of progress that's occurring. So all of that get mixed into Hegel, that I think is one of the reasons why it's been difficult to get Hegel, because I think also, like you said, Hegel himself is compelled by a vision of a whole that he himself doesn't fully understand and is trying to find the resources to understand it after he's been hit with that vision, just like Faulkner looking for the story to fit in the vision of Caddy in the tree, and he's trying to bring it down. And so he doesn't have necessarily the resources the whole time to clarify what he's speaking about or what he's doing. So that leads to the kind of splintering of all these different interpretations. But definitely, the entire thrust of Hegel's conceptual mediation requires the problem of enjoyment, which requires the issues of psychoanalysis to be at the very forefront.
Yeah, let me say so on Hegel not getting himself. It's a purely structural point, because I'm not saying I get Hegel.
Yeah.
But it's structurally necessary that he couldn't understand, and it doesn't really matter how much time he had, even if he lived up to it being 100 years.
Sure.
It's also like, I guess, some kind of structural point to us being the completers.
Yeah.
To us, like when you read a text, you are the one filling in the gaps, even if you don't do that consciously, right? Like this is also where things get lost in translation, and you get different meanings to that. But I think a Hegelian point would be not to lament the loss in translation of writing necessarily, but yeah. It is true, though, that when reading Nietzsche, I refuse to read Nietzsche in English.
That's funny.
That's something I don't do.
Well, and I should just note, in Hegel, once you know a limit, you've transcended the limit, right? So if Hegel was exploring the limits of thought and knew the limits of thought before he did it, they really wouldn't be the limits of thought, right? You'd be beyond them. So Hegel, as a true philosopher, basically must be exposing topics that he doesn't know the answers ahead of time, because if he did, it wouldn't be the limit of thought, right? If Hegel is indeed pushing against the limits of thought, and he's that radical density of thought Žižek mentions at the beginning of Less and Nothingness, then there has to be a unknown that Hegel himself is dealing with, or otherwise he's already beyond the limit, because he already knows the limit, right? So it is, again, to me, what's interesting with Hegel, like I've been mentioning literature, is like, from a kind of literary analysis, you could say that the medium is the medium matches the message, like the form matches the meaning of Hegel, right? Like evidence of a good poem is when the structure of the poem replicates the content of the poem, okay? And I could go through like Wallace Stevens is very good at that. Well, likewise in Hegel, the thing is that the form of the philosophy and his overall project matches the very content of that project, right? Like it wouldn't make sense if Hegel was telling you, hey, a limit you know is a limit you've transcended, and then he knows everything in his project, because that would by definition mean he's not exploring the limits of thought, right? So that's one of the reasons, like what I find very interesting about Hegel is some of the literary structures. Now that's another topic, and I'm not saying I'm an expert on that, but just like I'm talking about the layers of the phenomenology of spirit, talking about a historic social reality and an internal reality, that's kind of like a double entendre. In a way, that would be Shakespeare, but it's like it's operating on two levels at the same time. I think Hegel does that a lot, actually, and that's fairly profound. And it's not really, I guess you could go like a Straussian reading of The Prince or something, where he's like these writers are doing codes and secret things. And I actually do think that's true in Machiavelli. But in the way that Hegel does it is not so much Straussian, in my opinion, as it is actually literary. And that's pretty profound, but it would also make sense. Again, this is what's remarkable to me. If indeed Hegel is supporting some sort of AB, then it would match, the form would match the content if the content has multiple layers. You see, that would be AB. If the layer was just the layer, that would be AA. But if the layer is also another layer, that would be AB. You see, and to me, what's so interesting, we were talking, like, for me, the philosophy of right is like state is the B of the A of spirit, or vice versa. Like now I'd have to explain what I mean in this crazy paper. Like the state, when Hegel, state is the natural expression of spirit, where spirit is the notional expression of state. If we take nature and notion, like a Holgate or whoever talks about, right? So you need, like, state is the B of spirit, and spirit is the A of the B, right? It's both of those together, and that has different ramifications. But again, that's another literary example where Hegel is following it's almost like as Hegel writes his philosophy, he's saying, hey, does the form of the philosophy I'm writing match its content? And if not, I better go write a different book. I better go write something that actually folds into itself to create those multiple layers. But then, of course, another literary move would be to say, isn't that psychoanalysis? Isn't psychoanalysis always something else going on? When someone asks for coffee, they're not asking for coffee. Isn't literature always about when a character is doing A, they're really doing it because of B? Like that right there is, again, another example of a formal isomorphic structure that's going on. And I think really taking seriously that there's these kind of isomorphic structures, these double entendres or whatever going on in Hegel is really, really important, and also can give further justification for the difficulty of the writing. Like when we go into James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake and we go, this is hard, we don't go, it's gobbledygook. Well, it may feel like gobbledygook, but basically every word has an intention and a point. And the reason it is like it is because of the design. I think there's quite a bit of that going on in Hegel, where the design of it to be working on these different layers is part of the reason. So it's a justified difficulty, I guess I'm saying. Like the difficulty of Finnegan's Wake is not arbitrary. It's not like Joyce is like, let me just be a dick. He's like, no, there's a justification for the difficulty, right? And I think there's something similar perhaps in Hegel.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating, because to me this means we go to topics of like the dialectics of dialectics and non-dialectics, or like the dialectics of A and AB.
Yes.
And so yeah, Hegel didn't just say a positing limit is its own transcendence and that's the end of the story, it's all just sublations and negations. No, it's so damn fucking difficult. And that's I mean, it's it keeps being a question to me every time he comes with new concepts of like, how do you justify this? And then he always says, yeah, it's immediate. I know it's immediate. I just read the word. You just came. It seems like it comes from nowhere. But then you keep reading and then you look back. And this is actually, in the chapter on the doctrine of being, on the chapter of existence, he talks about finitude and infinity. And then all of a sudden he brings in art and Kantian philosophy. Now, why does he do this? Well, in German, determination and destination and vocation are all Bestimmung. And I've been asking myself the question, like, is he making this move because he's writing German philosophy? Would he have written it this way if he was writing in English? And I'm not sure. I'm not so sure, but maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. But this is the kind of question that comes to me. And you can also look at it from another sense that, okay, Hegel had this certain kind of realization of AB, which he actually grounds in Christianity. He's very clear at the beginning of the book, this is Christian metaphysics.
Yeah.
And if you don't grasp the foundation of the oscillation of being, or the transition of being and nothing in a contained becoming, or in other words, the fact that something can come out of nothing, which is the ground of Christian metaphysics for Hegel, then it's you cannot get the point. So in regards to language, I'm not sure how I would go about this, but one way to view it is that, okay, Hegel had this kind of realization of AB, and we must transcend the understanding when doing proper speculative philosophy, and therefore for him it was logical to write the Science of Logic, since it is such a low level kind of work. So this is really at the edge of my thinking. I'm not sure how to think of these things yet. I think I will become clearer once I get to go deeper into the book.
No, I think it's magnificent. A few things. I think it is very, very important to when Hegel talks about the Christian metaphysics, it's so difficult for people in the West to get what that even is, because the notion of Christianity has been, I want to say, poisoned by a cheap Platonism. And as we've talked about, and as a result, it's not really clear. Like, Christianity's metaphysics is this very bizarre incarnational metaphysics, a bothness. It's this really weird bothness. And like I've mentioned, when he says the being of spirit is a bone, that screams the Eucharist. Like this bread that is also God and also bread. That's some crazy stuff right there. And then, of course, there's a massive debate between Protestantism and Christianity and East Orthodox and all these different things. But regardless what side you end up, like, the Protestants tell the Catholics, they actually have a better argument than people give them credit for. Like, they'll say, hey, if you're saying God can arbitrarily change the creative order into becoming God's body, then you're saying creation is arbitrary, right? And actually, some of the Protestants were like, we actually have a higher view of the Eucharist, because we're saying that everything is already like transubstantiated in its very being. And that's why Hegel I think he aligns more with Protestantism than the others, because it actually elevates, now, unfortunately, most Protestants today have a more symbolic view of the Eucharist, where it's just a symbol of God's body. But actually, that's not, if you go to the Reformation, that's not exactly what they said. They were saying that the Catholic version implies that a thing becomes transubstantial, as opposed to all of creation already being transubstantial, right? That's a very interesting, different debate than what you hear. And we also have to remember that early Protestants did not think they were Protestants. They thought they were just a continuation of the Catholic Church, right? We always forget that. Now, I know East Orthodox then brings in Paggio, and he's right. Like, if you read Bukakov, Bajayev, these different people, they'll be like, no, the Eucharist is the body of God precisely because it's a symbol, and that everything is symbolic. Regardless, all of it is an AB. Like, the entire metaphysics is very, very AB. And Hegel is basically following that in hey, that makes sense that everything's AB. Because if you look at that bookshelf over there, it is simultaneously both a bookshelf and not a bookshelf at the same time. And you also cannot separate the phenomenon from the conceptual mediation of understanding it as a bookshelf, but then also trying to reason it as what it is in that instability. So that's all based, that's all an epistemology that absolutely shares in a Christian metaphysic. But it's hard for people today to get that, unfortunately, because their conception of Christianity is a cheap Platonism. Now, over the years, I've gotten much kinder toward Plato, because I have been convinced that Plato is different from Platonism, as I am also being convinced that Kant is different from Kantianism. But that's an entirely different ballgame, and then it's just like, what do we do with that? I don't know. So it's a fun game. But to what you're saying about the Christian metaphysics, I think also when you take seriously the notion that it becomes kind of dialectical all the way down, and that everything is down, you always then have to be engaged in an active thinking, right? And so then once you move to the logic, Hegel's like, okay, how does one speculatively reason of what it means that you always have to be actively thinking? What is the nature of the human subject, of being, of the world, that a perpetual activity, becoming, but not an autonomous becoming, but a becoming that is always becoming a being and then a becoming boom, boom. I think Ebert's language of the wave is actually extremely good. And open, close, open, close. I think his paper on the sublation of mathematics really does capture the one in many section of the science of logic. I think it's a beautiful structure. Well, what does it mean that that is the nature of things? Like, why is that how things are? And what would the implications of that be for logic? Well, the funny thing is, whatever you arrive at itself has to have the open-close structure, right? How do you speculatively reason about a conclusion that must entail its own destabilization? Like, how can you arrive at a conclusion that whatever you arrive at will destabilize itself, right? Like, there's a way to read absolute knowing, where absolute knowing is where you come to understand that you must be a being that has control of, that is the source of your own limits. So since you're the kind of source of your limits, you have a control over them, but then at the same time, you must be a being that has control over your own limits, meaning you must think in terms of AB. You must think in terms of AB. Oh, so wait, then I am limited in a kind of not limited way, right? Oh, now we have an unlimited with the UN in parentheses. Oh, now we have an incompleteness with the IN in parentheses, right? So whatever conclusion you reach will also be kind of an unconclusion with the UN in parentheses. Like whatever conclusion is arrived at will also have this character of you reaching the conclusion is then the stand-in to make it the conclusion. Like you know how we're saying that you as the incompleteness stand in the place to make the incompleteness of the IN in parentheses? There's something about reaching the conclusion that then makes that be the conclusion because you are reaching it as the subject who is thinking that conclusion. But then it falls away. And then you do it again. Then it falls away. And it's almost like Hegel is then saying the conclusion is the ever activity of which makes there be something to fall away. Because if there's not something to fall away, that means we're effaced. That means the game is over. That means we're not standing in there to be the incompleteness as the IN in parentheses, because there's nothing falling away. And this is what's really weird. I think we mentioned it in a neck conversation. Like, if I never have the pen, I have an open hand, is it the same as if I picked up the hand and dropped it? Same end, an empty hand, but there's a difference between the hand that picks up a pen and drops it and one that never picks it up, right? Yeah. So the process of the loss changes the character of the loss versus the never have in the first place. And so the science of logic is the justification of that. And so the conclusion is a conclusion you can't stop concluding. The conclusion is a conclusion that you can't stop concluding. And that's where your brain is like, F this. And Hegel's like, no, you can't F this because that means the conclusion becomes an effacement. That to me is a lot of the structure of the logic that he's also said, hey, by the way, the reason you had to go the phenomenology of spirit to do this is to be the kind of subject that would see history developing this way. So now when logic turns out to develop this way, you have a proof of history to believe that this conclusion about logic is accurate. By proof, reason to believe, right? Okay, if history had this structure, and now we have reason to think logic has this structure, history is the proof that this logic is not crazy, because it sounds crazy. So there's good reason to think it's crazy. But remember the phenomenology of spirit, that's your proof that this is not crazy. And so that it all kind of goes together. Like I always like to say literature is the mathematics of the humanity. You know, if all good literature entails irony, if you grant me this, well, then there would be reason to think there's something about irony that's ontological to the human subject. You know, if great literature always has like characters like Hamlet caught between value centers and torn apart, then there would be reason to think that there's something about the human subject that tends to end up like Hamlet, that it's not merely accidental, but ontological. It's like deep or substantive, to use that language, right? So literature is a kind of proof of human nature. It's like I call it the mathematics of the humanities, if you will. You know, it's a kind of proof. Well, likewise, the phenomenology of spirit functions as a proof to the logic. Like the phenomenology of spirit, like history, is a kind of proof of how logic is. And if history has unfolded this way, if the subject has devoted this way, then that would have reason to think that the logical underlying structure of the unfolding of history and the subject is in fact AB, not AA. And you really need that proof, because if you just arrive at the AB conclusion, one, it hasn't been conceptually mediated, so you're not going to absorb it and believe it. And two, because it's kind of crazy sounding, you're going to like say that's crazy sounding and you're going to doubt it. So he has to do all this work to get you to the place where you believe that there's reason to assent to this. And if it's not there, then you probably won't assent to this, or you may assent to it without really understanding the depths of what it means. Just like the artist who knows but doesn't understand, like we were saying at the beginning, without the conceptual mediation, you may know that AB is what you need, but you won't really understand it in a manner that changes your life or carries how you treat, you know, different people or how you treat yourself. And therefore, it won't be an address to the psychological concerns or the psychoanalytical concerns of, say, enjoyment. Like if you know AB, but you don't understand AB, it's not going to deal with the problem of enjoyment, you see, like we've been talking with psychoanalysis. Yeah. So you have to go through it to actually have it. It has to go through all that so that it moves from the realm of being a mere explanation to then becoming an address, to use the language I always like to like. So that's why you have to have the phenomenology of spirit. Without the phenomenology of spirit, the science of logic would only be an explanation. But by having the philosophy of spirit, it can be an address. And so they can go together.
Yeah, a lot's coming up for me. On the thing about you know, the pen and holding it, and a great example here is that in some kind of movie, there's someone who asks someone out for a coffee, and this person says, "Yeah, sure, but I don't like coffee." And this other person is like, "Okay, that's fine. I don't have any anyway." So nothing happens, right? But it's not an abstract nothing. There's something. And in the movie, it's like they do it in a flirtatious way. So it's very obvious that it's a sexual invitation. Now, so this kind of nothingness, you know, at the end, it's a surplus. You get something more out of it, you know? And yeah, that's really something fascinating. Now, to talk about AA and AB, well, I think the understanding holds AA for a law of logic, whereas from the standpoint of AB or of reason, it holds AA for a principle of thought, principle of thought, not the law of logic.
That's right.
And this has huge consequences for responsibility and desire.
Yes.
Which is also relevant to what you just said about address and explanation. Now, Hegel actually used the language of like the understanding does not take responsibility for itself sub later. Right. So a very simple example here is changing, you know, who you are or changing your thoughts. You know, like to take responsibility for that you are a creative and free subject means that you're responsible for it. And there's this deep internalizing activity that you do with philosophy, right? And Nietzsche talks about, thus I have willed it, to take up everything, or as Hegel would say, to take necessity as a moment of freedom, as freedom being necessity for itself. This means you're taking responsibility for it as it is something as it is something that you own up to it. Now, this like self-recognition in absolute otherness that philosophy asks us to do, like proper philosophy, it's crazy. But I think it really requires an openness of heart, and not everyone is up for the task. Also, Science of Logic by Hegel is not dry at all. Like, it sounds very dry, right? Science of Logic. Well, it's not dry at all. It's very it's a book that you're really involved with while reading it. It's at least how you're supposed to read it. And Hegel talks a lot about instincts and food, and when the finitude of when you're hungry and you want to eat something, and then you're ravenously eating whatever snack, and then it's gone. This leads us nowhere. Of course, we have to eat, but the realm of universality for Hegel is infinite. So that's where this is actually opening things up for us. And also, it's not like infinite in this grand, amazing manner that Hegel also says, soul and spirit light up when they hear the term infinity. No, it's also a problem. And Alenka Zupancic has an amazing book. I think you will really love it. It's called Ethics of the Real. And she talks about the relationship between Kantian philosophy, and especially his ethics, and Lacan. And at the end of the book, she concludes that the answer, in the Platonist reading of Christianity, there is this gift of an afterlife, right, after this world. Well, she says, well, since this has kind of fallen away with the death of God, our answer to it from us as philosophers shouldn't be just the pathos of the finite. This doesn't suffice. And she says that actually true infinity is enjoyment, and like it latches onto and parasitizes on finitude, or as Žižek would say it, infinity is nothing but the self-mediation of the finite. So it's pervasive. It can be a problem, and it's a vortex that we're caught up into. Now, we're caught up into it mostly unconsciously, right? With our drives, and sexually especially, and this is the domain of desire. Now, Lacan said that it doesn't really matter whether you're conscious of it or not, or unconscious. You have to take responsibility for it, because otherwise I can say, oh yeah, I did it unconsciously, I don't know. No, but you enjoyed it unconsciously, and for this you have to take responsibility. So these are reasons why I really love Hegel, and this is really central to me. And this is also where the notion of reconciliation comes in regards to what you call explanation and address, right? Because in my city there's this Hegelian, and I talked with him about this, and he says, like in the Science of Logic, there's this kind of absolute reconciliation where all, it's kind of like the standard reading of Hegel, where all contradictions are basically gone. But I think it's still a big question for me. I mostly have huge questions, right? But like what Hegel means by resolution or reconciliation is not a finding rest in some kind of abstraction, right? Like it's a kind of being with the restlessness that's it's a reconciliation with one-sidedness.
Yes.
With the necessity of one-sidedness.
Yes.
And also, what's so important here is that, when I'm talking, I have to say sentence after the sentence, which means I have to talk in a one-sided way, right? I say, this is the truth, not that is the truth.
Yes.
Well, you can say with everything, no, but you're one-sided, but then you're never going to hear what I truly have to say. And so really to listen to me, or when I listen to you, or when we talk to people in general, to take into account that whatever is coming to you directly is not their eternal dogmatic position.
Right.
It's going to self-sublate all the time. And this like hermeneutical infinity that we have, like to take that into account and to truly listen to the other person and understand it on their own accord within themselves, not to bring in other things like this. This is also extremely important. So I believe Hegel kind of can teach one to do that in terms of what you call address. Now, what I think, what's really inspired me, what's really inspiring to me in Hegel is the reconciliation with the present and philosophy as comprehending what is, or like actuality. Because I tend to try to stay away of like thinking about the future philosophically. That's perhaps also why I'm not so much into I'm kind of distant from politics, not that I'm not interested in it, but I try to be careful with thinking about the future and thinking about grand things. And it's really like it's really your most vulnerable moments, the moments of negativity, of loneliness, or of disillusionment, in general disillusionment, whether it comes to career or whatever, sexually, to like reconcile with the abyss that we can experience there.
Magnificent. That was.
There's also freedom itself, right?
Yes.
Freedom.
Truly marvelous. A few things. First off, it's very interesting because earlier in life, 10 or whatever years ago, I did get something out of Derrida, which was a kind of unleash from how language precisely can structure you ahead of time towards certain conclusions. Like there's a way in which speaking, you were making the point that it has to be sequential. The very structure of thought makes you think anti-dialectic because it has a sequential structure. So to really get dialectic, you have to think beyond or above or whatever term, the very mediums of operation in the world, like the very mediums of operation in the world, like language or time or action. All of these things have a sequential character that phenomenologically present themselves in terms of understanding, not reason, in terms of AA, not AB. To get the B, you have to add that to the world, per se. You have to know it and abstractly add it to the world, as if you're not adding, but then in that there's a negation because you're adding something that's already there. You just don't have the apparatus to get what's already there. So even the thought of this is not what I think it is itself is a kind of medium of which presents it as an AA. Even thinking AB presents the thought of AB as an AA. So you're this mess, really. You're this mess of having to use vehicles to think. You have to use vehicles of understanding to reason. Well, that's tricky. And right there, that means there's a contradiction. And you see, the term contradiction is so interesting because what Hegel seems to be doing, if we take Dr. McGowan's work, is a contradiction is not an effacement. A contradiction is an aliveness, an activity, a movement, right? The moment I use a vehicle of understanding to reason, there's a tension, there's an activity. There's a thing not going together. And if everything is AB, then what is most fundamental is that tension, not AA, right? Which again matches with Christian metaphysics, because most fundamental reality is a trinity, which is a one of many, which is a dance, which is a mystery, which is a split one that yet finds harmony in that split one, where on this side, in finitude, the split one is not something we naturally have come to live with or harmonize with or understand, where God as Trinity seems to have actually used the split one to reach some sort of higher state of being than a unified one. The split one seems to actually open up some kind of higher form of being that is not possible in the singular one, and yet we seem fallen in a state where our natural experience is either A, to seek a whole one, which is pathological, 2, view the split one as a problem, and yet the name of the game is to somehow see the split one as making possible a dance that is highest being, right? That's the game, but that goes against everything that is naturally presented to us, right? And so back when I was doing Derrida, I started using a lot of like parentheses to free myself from language, and the term I always liked was nothing with the no in parentheses. Like nothing is always a no thing in parentheses. You see what I'm saying? And so the science of logic is basically saying the onto-epistemological foundation is a nothing with the O-N, with the N-O in parentheses, right? And of course, that's a conclusion that says that the conclusion is ever concluding because the no thingness in of itself entails that tension. It's the moment you talk about nothing with the parentheses, then it's an entity of reason put into terms of understanding. Tension, tension, tension. I also like that because I got from Derrida where he talked about difference. You always hear it as difference when that's not what he's saying. You know, the sound and what it is on paper are different. He's playing with. I also like the parentheses move because there's a difference between the sound and what you see on paper because you don't typically say parentheses, right? And so there's an AB in that. Like the language has an AB structure in its very tension. That's a kind of fallenness. I can't speak nothing with the NO in parentheses. I can only write it, right? Well, that's the tension of the understanding and the reason. You can only get the reason in the writing, right? Yeah. And so you're kind of bound. So that always speaks to that tension. And that's, all of that is the realm of Hegel's logic. All of that, like thinking all of that and living and wrestling with all of that is what Hegel is presenting us with. He's presenting us with a lot of terms that have a parenthesis. The other thing that I think is so great, the other thing that I find very interesting is when he calls it the science of logic. Why would he call it the science of logic? Because it's a move where he's saying all science is scientist of logic. The subject is always part of science. He's basically going to war against the notion of a science that doesn't have a logic. Oh, and a logic is always conceptually mediated by a subject. So you could also almost talk about the science of logic can also be kind of the logic of science. And the logic of science is always a conceptual mediation of a subject. There is no such thing as a science that can ever escape the need for the conceptual mediation of the subject. And so I always take it as almost kind of when he calls it like the science of logic, he's making a giant declaration that basically science as AA is impossible. There is no ontic base. Let's put it this way. Whenever you talk about the ontic, you're talking about it ontologically. Now, I don't want to say that through the scientific method, you cannot arrive at something that is practically probably has something to do with the ontic because it keeps reappearing no matter how many times you do the experience. So you can get something that's practically ontic, but Hegel wants to say it's not technically ontic because it's still ontologically mediated, right? But that little difference may just sound nitpicky, but for Hegel, that's a huge deal. Like the most human beings can ever do is something that's practically ontic. And by ontic, I mean what would exist if there were no human subjects, right? It was, you know, the ontic and the ontological is the ontic as conceptually mediated, right? So science visions itself as in the business of the ontic, not the ontological. And what basically Hegel forces you to say is you can get stuff that is practically ontic. And I love the term practical because it means almost ontic, but not. And it also means you practice it, like it's something that emerges in practice. So it's a funny double word. It's like my favorite word to use because practically ontic, but not technically ontic. And Hegel's like, that's a big deal. Don't you ever forget that because you can never avoid the responsibility of ontology. You are always responsible for what you're doing. You can't use science or AA logic to escape responsibility. So Hegel, what we always have to remember, if Hegel is ultimately a philosopher of freedom, he's also a philosopher of responsibility because freedom is always responsibility. So he has created an AB logic, which is an AB onto-epistemology. That means you are free, but that means you are also responsible because what exists is partially due to your involvement in it somehow. Your involvement in the world impacts how the world unfolds, so you are responsible. Oh, but that also means you're free because there's not a world that is utterly dependent on you that you have no impact on. Yeah, it determines you, but you can turn determination into necessity by your involvement in it is the language I use, where you have to necessarily confront it, but it no longer bounds you, but that means you're responsible. And that double move is so critical because that means you can never escape yourself. And that's why we're now in psychoanalysis. Because if you're free and you're responsible, then who are you? Because you're responsible for who you are. And so the freedom which is, I like to say in the paper on Hegel's justification of Hegel, that it's a movement from determinants to necessity. You must necessarily be in the world, but how you confront that necessity is now shaped. You have an involvement in it. Another way to think about it is Owen Barfield, who I've come to love Owen Barfield. He asked the question of, let's take a rainbow. So a rainbow exists because your eye, raindrops, and sunlight, right? You know, and it's not a hallucination because lots of people can see the rainbow. So you are responsible for the rainbow. The rainbow would not be there if you weren't there in the conditions of the sunlight, the raindrops, and you. Now, that doesn't mean the rainbow is reducible to your subjectivity, but it does mean that your involvement is necessary for the rainbow to be there. And so you, to some degree, are responsible for the existence of the rainbow. Hegel's basically saying that's everything. Everything is like that. You are responsible for all phenomenon to some degree. Now, not totally, but to some degree, buddy. So don't you forget that next time you're trying to run from your relationship with science, next time you're trying to run from your community with the government project of saving the world or whatever. Oh, I'm just following reason. I'm just following rationality. The game theory dynamics, the AI said I need to do X, Y, and Z. It's not me, it's the AI. And Hegel's like, no, you're always responsible. There's no exit. It's very Saudian, actually. You're responsible. So what are you going to do about it? You know, how are you going to respond? And Hegel is very, very big on that. The last thing I'll say that I think is really important for Hegel is following the Christian metaphysic again. If we go back to Augustine and all these different people, sin is a misordered good, okay? Fallenness is a misorder. So it's all about order, really. Not order in a kind of like control order, but like rightly arranging, okay? It's not about finding something. It's about figuring out how to order what is already present in the right manner. There's nothing wrong with sex, but there's something wrong with lust because it's a misordered relationship to sex. There's nothing wrong with food, but there's something wrong with gluttony because it's a misordered relationship to gluttony. Okay, most philosophers in history have been looking for something. They've been seeking something. What Hegel does is like, no, 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 everything we have is right here. The problem is ordering it. And that's the work of conceptual mediation. You see, philosophy, and even theologians and most people have all been in the business of finding something. And that's been, of course, a form of the big other. What Hegel was like, no, the name of the game is ordering things. And what we've been doing is we've been putting AA as primary, when really AA is simply a mental model of AB. AA is very useful. It is a mode of thinking that helps you get through your day. Understanding is very useful. Hegel is not saying that understanding is bad. He's saying it's bad when it's out of order with reason. Out of order is the key phrase. Hegel's thinking is not a, how do we like escape all of these things and get to the like the promised land? It's always an ordering structure. But that in of itself is from a Christian tradition. Because body is not bad. Incarnational, the world is not bad, but it's very bad when it's out of order with God, right? But likewise, the crazy thing that you see in like the stories of other religions in Christianity is God is bad when he's out of order with world because he becomes an idol. So even God can be bad if he's out of order in relationship with creation because it's not incarnational or relationship. So Hegel, the only way you understand Hegel is to think of him as a philosopher not looking for truth per se, but ordering the phenomenon that are already presented so that they can be absolute, of which then would be the relation of the subject and the ontoepistemology of AB. So the other reason, the way to read Hegel, in addition to these literary forms, is to see, and in the Christian metaphysics, is to see him ordering what is, as opposed to finding the Platonic form. But of course, that's psychoanalysis, right? Because psychoanalysis is often a certain ordering of what is pre-existent so that you manage it. And like you were saying with enjoyment, enjoyment's not bad. It's just that naturally we tend to make it bad because we don't conceptually mediate it. The name of the game is how do we make enjoyment, if you give me this language, how do you make enjoyment joy, right? Like, how do you move, like the highest, one of the highest virtues in Christianity is joy because that's mixed with holiness, right? Okay, so human beings seem to naturally engage in the psycho-Lacanian enjoyment, right? But the very condition of the possibility of enjoyment is necessary for joy, right? So you have to have the possibility of disordering joy into enjoyment so that you could possibly order it into enjoyment. Like if you're going to eat food, there has to be the possibility of gluttony, right? If there's going to be sex, there has to be the possibility of lust, right? Likewise, if there's going to be joy, there has to be the possibility of enjoyment that leads to all the pathological. So then the name of the game is the ordering so that you have joy and not enjoyment, right? But that requires the conceptual mediation and not merely the thinking, oh, there's a difference between joy and enjoyment, but the experience and work of conceptually mediating yourself to the place where your life is one of joy as opposed to the enjoyment that leads to the death drive and all of these other seekings of the big brother and different things like that. So thinking about Hegel in terms of an ordering so that the things that one already has comes forth in their sublimated form of joy as opposed to enjoyment is another way, I think, how we can see the intersection of the psychoanalytical and the Christian metaphysic.
Yeah, that's however, I do think that, you know, you talked about this mode of seeking versus finding, and I do think this is a super interesting topic, but when we posit joy, don't we already fall into this again? Where we are at enjoyment, this is here, and we are going to joy that's over there.
It's a very good point, but the issue is the seeking of the true infinity as the seeking of the spurious infinity. There is a kind of, because even seeking itself cannot be bad if it is rightly ordered. It's the problem is for most of history, seeking has been a disordered form of going into a spurious infinity as opposed to seeking in what is to relate to it as a true infinity. So there's a sense in which the circle seeks the other side so that it can be a circle. But then when it succeeds, as if it wasn't seeking at all. It was always already. That's the crazy, tricky move in Hegel. The thing you find is always already. It's a realization, not a kind of bringing in. And that's the weird move. Like that's what I'm saying. Like the end of the science of logic is a kind of like concluding of not concluding. Okay. So likewise, Hegel's like a seeking of a thing you have. What? Yeah, but that's the issue. Like the success of the seeking of the true infinity is a negation of the seeking into the sublation of the true infinity as a circle. Once the line finds the other side of the line, it's as if it was never seeking it at all. It's as if it's returned to the place of its beginnings and known it for the very first time, to use the end of T.S. Eliot, where the fire and rose are one and neither is consumed.
Yeah. Yeah, that is it's super important topic. Like what does it mean that Hegel says in the preface of the phenomenology of spirit that for him philosophy is not just love of wisdom but true knowing. It is kind of what you're getting to. That's how I understand it. And of course, like science of logic is also like this, you know. This is why people get very hysterical when reading Hegel, even if you like him. It's like, how can he do this? Say truth is this is that, this is like explicate logic on this sense. And he really comes from this standpoint, right? When you read like this, I think it's very phallic standpoint of knowing and the absolute, and this is where we're going, and this is what how it is. Now, Lacan and Žižek call Hegel the most sublime hysteric, and I think there's a deep truth to that as well. So this basically, I believe it was Žižek, I'm not so sure, but he said that the whole movement of German idealism is kind of like anti-philosophy, because you also get it with Fichte. He doesn't call his ideas philosophy anymore, he calls it Wissenschaftslehre, which is like, yeah, it's like a kind of science. It's a kind of like study of science. Now, in terms of life and logic, is that for Hegel, when concepts are dead and don't have life, he means it literally. He's not like being poetic about it. Like there is the aliveness of concepts. To judge an aliveness of a concept is really to make a judgment about life and being in life. Now, in terms of loss, I think it's interesting to connect this to the idea of hope. right? Because if something is lost, then there is no hope. And Žižek says that once we go from understanding to reason, we don't get anything, but we lose the beyond. So you kind of lose this this wanting to find, to seek. you find and you find all the time, and you find in your very seeking as well. So it's a process of disillusionment, for sure. I think that's also why it can be so painful, you know. And Hegel himself says it's painful and to practice with being a proper speculative thinker, tarrying with negativity. Now, I don't think Hegel is against any concept of hope necessarily. He's not just like throwing it out the window. But I do think like the very, it's also being called like the in-betweenness of our humanity, you know, is a privilege, is a total ontological privilege to be in, not to be removed from infinity, but the fact that, you know, we can think and comprehend infinity. Yeah, so, and also but it gets very paradoxical very quickly. And in terms of the finding and the seeking, well, it would kind of be like, you know, Lacan has the notion of ecstasy, which is something that's both at once intimate and external.
That's right.
And Hegel talks about it in the same way in the Science of Logic. Like something can be external, but also within. Right. But the very fact that it is within doesn't take away any of its externality, like the rainbow, you know. Like the fact that it's purely within doesn't mean it's not outside, and it doesn't also mean that the external is next to the internal. No, it means they're the same paradoxical moment.
That's right.
Or the same paradoxical truth. And yeah.
No, that's outstanding. Again, and alas, I've enjoyed this very much. I will have to go in a little bit to help the children get ready, but this has been a delight, Dimitri. I really appreciate it. And but a few more things, because what you just said was so golden, and I've got time. It's again, the very category of the internal and the external kind of simultaneously going together is arguably something religion could train you, because the Holy Spirit is within you, but God is also transcendent of you. That kind of, like, there's something about thinking paradoxically that religion could get you used to. Like like you would be more habituated to doing that. And because God is transcendent, but he's also intimate. Life is death, but death is also life. You know, there's this weirdness that goes on. The bread is the body of God, Eucharist, whatever. That with the loss of religion, if you were to say in the West, the loss of Christianity, you're out of the habit of thinking that way. And then, of course, if thinking that way is necessary for living life or doing it well or something like, or dealing with yourself, well, then the loss of that is going to lead into nihilism, bad nihilism, the meaning crisis, all this stuff that people are talking about, because you're not habituated to swim in those waters, and those waters are reality. So you just end up sinking or something like that. So I think that's very important. Derrida's, I think, like his favorite thing that Heidegger ever wrote, because in many respects, Derrida is just kind of a literary form of Heidegger, and that's an overfit, but there's a lot to that. So Heidegger once apparently wrote like a letter. I don't know if it's a letter, maybe it's an essay, where he crossed out being everywhere. He put like a dash through it. And Derrida's like, yes, that's exactly right. Like that's deconstruction right there, where the very appearance of a thing is what negates it. Derrida's actually kind of Hegelian without knowing he's Hegelian, like I guess all of us basically. But what's very interesting is that like Derrida kind of wanted to claim that Heidegger was at his best when he thought about being with a slash through it. Like Heidegger was at his best when being had a slash through it. And I actually do think that Heidegger becomes way more interesting when you take seriously the clearing notion that he's going through and focus almost on that more than being. Now, I'm not saying being isn't primary to Heidegger, but the clearing stuff is very, very valuable. Likewise, philosophy tends to be at its best when you do a dash through it. So all of these anti-philosophers tend up doing really good philosophy. Or these like David Hume is one of my favorite philosophers, and he's basically like, philosophy is a problem. Exactly, David Hume. You're so good at philosophy. Like all of these philosophers that have a dash through philosophy tend to unlock something in that then like makes philosophy alive, because they sublate it without meaning to. They negate it and thus sublate it, and so often the anti-philosophers end up being the negation of philosophy that sublates it into the philosophy you need, actually. And that's kind of an irony that happens all the time. And you see that and then of course Hegel's like, why does that happen? Like, what is the logic under the onto-epistemology that makes it the case that it's the anti-philosophers that tend to arise to these great movements in philosophy? Well, I guess logic can't be AA, it must be AB. Because when you think you negate something, that's actually when you get it more to its quote-unquote truth, right? When you negate philosophy, then you unlock its B, and now it's AB, and now there we go, that's what philosophy is supposed to do. So there's something very important there. The other thing, like, it's very interesting with the finding and the seeking sort of language, because like when you go through so many, and same with wisdom, right? Like Zizek was making fun of wisdom lately, because yeah, there's like go off and gain wisdom, but there's something about going and getting, and then you'll be enlightened that seems problematic, right? Well, in ancient traditions, there's this emphasis on like presence, stoicism, you know, being here and not wanting to be elsewhere. There's kind of this idea of the secret is somehow a not seeking, a not desiring. But then there's also a problem with that, because effacement is not the same as negation. If you just say, I'm just not going to desire anything, you haven't done any conceptual mediation. You know, as you've heard me say a million times with David Hume, there's the starting in common life, which is actually bad if you stay there. But then there's going on the philosophical journey to the ivory tower, where you stay at the ivory tower, and that's bad. You have to return to the common life. That then makes a return with the RE in parentheses, and that's different, right? You have to go through desire to sublate it into something that can make you truly want the farm. Like if you start at the farm and you say, well, I just don't have any desire to go anywhere else, your relation to the farm is not a true infinity. It's a kind of denial. But if you go to the ivory tower and you're like, I'm better than the farm, well, now you're just in a spurious infinity, because you're going to keep going from the ivory tower, then to the big city, then to the big thing, and you don't ever relate. You have to come, like the only way to truly engage with the common life in terms of a true infinity is for it to be in terms of a return, right? And so there's something about the ancient traditions on presence that are good, but the presence has to be earned. It has to be a costly presence, not a cheap presence, if you will. It has to be a costly return, not a cheap staying, if you were to use that language. I always like Bonhoeffer's language, the difference between cheap and costly, or cheap grace, costly grace. I use that all the time. But likewise, there's a difference between a cheap staying and a costly returning, of where you realize that basically everything you needed was always here. You just didn't have the eyes to see it, right? And that's kind of absolute knowing. Absolute knowing is when you get the eyes to see what was always already. And there is interesting, like in the Bible, like in Matthew, it says when the eyes are healthy, the whole body is filled with light, right? Like eyes and the ability to see something that is already the case. But you couldn't see it was already the case without the conceptual mediation. That seems to have a lot to do with the name of the game. And for me, the symbolic structure of this, you kind of see in laughter and tears. I always find laughter and tears interesting, because what do you do when like the world's on fire? Like a Joker character, they laugh. But what do you do when you have joy? You laugh, right? What do you do when you're really sad? You cry. What do you do when you're really happy? You cry. Same phenomenon, same tears, same water going down eye, but because of the different contexts, the meaning of that phenomenon is entirely different. Well, so it goes with all of phenomenon. All of phenomenon can be like a tear. One circumstance, it's nihilism. In another circumstance, it's joy. And the ability, so the question is, do you seek the ability to cry tears of joy? Or do you find it? Well, you've always had the ability to cry. You've always had the ability to laugh. But in order to laugh with that kind of belly laugh, that's a semblance of a joy that passeth understanding in a shanti shanti kind of way, one must earn it. You can't do that deep love of life laugh without the journey, without the work. You can't cry those tears of truly, truly experiencing life at its fullness without the work. And yet what you find is something that could have always been there, but couldn't it couldn't be unlocked until you went on the journey to unlock it. It's a returning to the place of your beginnings. It's a return to the ability to cry tears that once were sadness, but now are joy. It's the ability to really laugh and to take over your entire being that required the conceptual mediation. And so Hegel just wants you to be able to enjoy what you already have. You have life. The question is, can you get to the place where you feel alive? And I think Hegel gives us a guide to do that.
I agree with that. And that's also where the limits of philosophy come in.
Yes, yes, it is.
Because philosophy can do this in terms of the concept in some kind of, what would you call it, like a consciousness of the concept or an awareness of conceptual, in regards to meaning. Well, if we talk about meaning, there's a fundamental meaninglessness to meaning.
Yes, absolutely.
A certain, not only the fact that meaning is abyssal and contingent. Yeah, I'm going to have to develop my thoughts.
No, I mean, what you're saying is very important. Well, the way I would close, and then I will leave, this has been a joy. I've really enjoyed it, Dimitri, is that philosophy can explain that you need to laugh with your whole being, but only you can do it. Philosophy can bring you through Hegel to the place to explain why you need to laugh with your full being, which takes the work of the return and all these different things. But then only you can address that explanation with how you live your life, because only you can be the incompleteness with the I in parentheses. Only you can be the source of that true infinity in your own life. Only you can be the source of your own address. All philosophy can do is point that you need to do that. And then the question is, as it points to you while you're on stage of your own life, do you in fact go for it? Do you take the courage to go for it? But Dimitri, it's been a pleasure, my friend. Thank you for your time. I'd love to do this again. I always appreciate you, and thank you for your time, however late it may be. I appreciate that, and making an opportunity to speak, Dimitri. I've really enjoyed this.
Yeah, thank you. I'm grateful.
Absolutely. Absolutely.